It began as a quiet exchange inside a private drawing room at Windsor that no official briefing ever acknowledged. Yet within days, whispers spread through royal circles that a forgotten clause buried deep inside Prince Philip's final estate documents had resurfaced. What seemed like an ordinary inheritance matter was suddenly threatening to reopen old divisions within the House of Windsor, and at the center of it all stood Queen Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the rumors seemed too extraordinary to believe. The royal family has weathered countless storms over the years, from public scandals to private disputes, and palace insiders are no strangers to speculation. But this time felt different. The conversations were quieter, more cautious, and far more deliberate. Reports began to emerge that a confidential review of Prince Philip's estate papers had been conducted behind closed doors. No public statement accompanied the review. No explanation was offered. Yet those familiar with royal affairs noticed a sudden increase in discussion surrounding the late Duke of Edinburgh's long-term plans and the safeguards he may have put in place before his passing. What drew particular attention was the suggestion that one overlooked provision, hidden among the complex legal arrangements surrounding Philip's estate, had suddenly become relevant. For years, most observers assumed that the Duke's wishes had already been settled and fully understood. However, palace insiders reportedly began hinting that an important detail connected to the Edinburgh legacy had never attracted serious scrutiny until now. As legal experts quietly revisited old documents, questions started spreading through royal circles. Had Prince Philip anticipated future conflicts long before anyone else? Had he created protections designed to preserve his legacy in ways that only now were becoming clear? The growing speculation quickly fueled another sensitive discussion. Some reports suggested that supporters of Queen Camilla had expected greater influence over certain family assets and historic royal holdings as the monarchy entered a new era under King Charles. Whether those expectations were realistic remained unclear, but the sudden focus on Philip's estate appeared to complicate matters significantly. What had once seemed like a straightforward transition was now becoming a source of uncertainty, with competing interpretations emerging about what the late Duke truly intended. Behind the scenes, legal advisors were reportedly summoned to examine historical records and inheritance structures that stretched back decades. The fact that these reviews were taking place at all raised eyebrows among royal watchers. Even more intriguing was the increasingly visible involvement of Prince Edward. Throughout his life, Edward had maintained a reputation for quiet loyalty and steady service. Rarely drawn into palace drama, he now appeared to be playing a more active role as discussions surrounding his father's legacy intensified. The timing did not go unnoticed. As the days passed, one question continued to echo through royal circles with growing urgency. What exactly had Prince Philip left behind? Not merely in terms of wealth or property, but in terms of instructions, safeguards, and intentions. The deeper investigators looked, the more they sensed that this was not simply an inheritance story. It was a story about legacy, loyalty, and unfinished plans that refused to remain buried. And with every new whisper, the mystery only deepened, pulling more members of the royal family into its orbit. But the mystery surrounding the clause could not be understood without first examining the extraordinary significance of the Edinburgh estate itself. Long before inheritance disputes and palace whispers, the Edinburgh legacy represented something far greater than land, titles, or wealth. For Prince Philip, it was a symbol of duty, continuity, and sacrifice, a personal chapter of royal history he spent decades building. To understand why the alleged clause has generated so much intrigue, it is necessary to look beyond the legal arguments and into the deeper story that shaped Prince Philip's life. The title of Duke of Edinburgh was never merely a royal honor attached to his name. It became intertwined with his identity, his service, and his vision for the future of the monarchy. Throughout decades marked by extraordinary public responsibility, Philip devoted himself to strengthening institutions that he believed would outlast any single generation. While public attention often focused on the crown itself, those closest to royal affairs understood that the Edinburgh legacy occupied a special place in his thinking. It represented not only what he had achieved, but also what he hoped would endure after he was gone. As years passed, Philip became increasingly aware of the delicate balance between tradition and change. The monarchy was evolving, public expectations were shifting, new challenges emerged with every passing decade. Yet despite these changes, one principle remained constant in his mind. Certain legacies had to be protected. Reports and historical accounts have long suggested that he viewed the Edinburgh title as one of those legacies. It carried decades of work, commitment, and personal sacrifice. Preserving its meaning was not simply about honoring the past. It was about safeguarding a bridge between generations. That responsibility gradually drew attention toward Prince Edward. Unlike many royal figures who often found themselves at the center of headlines, Edward built his reputation through consistency and quiet dedication. Over time, observers noticed the close bond between father and son. While others attracted public scrutiny, Edward appeared to earn something different from Philip. Trust. Not the dramatic trust that creates headlines, but the steady trust that develops through years of reliability. Many royal watchers came to believe that Philip saw Edward as someone capable of carrying forward the values that had defined the Edinburgh legacy for decades. This belief only strengthened as Philip entered the later years of his life. Conversations surrounding succession, stewardship, and continuity reportedly became increasingly important. Those discussions were not necessarily about wealth or privilege. Instead, they centered on responsibility. What would happen when Philip was no longer there to protect the institutions he cared about? Who would ensure that the purpose behind the Edinburgh legacy remained intact? These questions lingered quietly beneath the surface, largely unnoticed by the public but deeply significant within royal circles. The emotional weight of the estate and title extended far beyond legal ownership. To many, it symbolized a lifetime of service. Every decision connected to it carried echoes of Philip's personal journey, his sacrifices, and his commitment to duty. That is why recent reports about a forgotten provision have generated such intense interest. If Philip truly anticipated future disputes, then the measures he may have taken were likely motivated by something larger than simple estate planning. They may have reflected his determination to protect a legacy he believed should never be shaped by shifting alliances or changing ambitions. As whispers continued to spread, concern grew among those who felt that Philip's final wishes must be honored exactly as intended. The more people examined his history, his values, and his carefully built legacy, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that every detail had been planned with extraordinary care. And if that was true, then the answers everyone was searching for might not be found in palace rumors or private expectations, but in a document whose significance was only now beginning to emerge. As historians revisited Philip's lifelong plans, attention turned to the legal document that would ultimately shape the future of his legacy. The document itself was never intended for public scrutiny. Yet, according to growing reports, one carefully crafted provision may have carried more power than anyone outside the royal legal circle realized. As interest in Prince Philip's legacy intensified, attention gradually shifted away from broad questions about inheritance and toward a far more specific mystery. Somewhere within the complex network of legal arrangements connected to his estate, reports suggested there existed a clause that few people had fully appreciated during Philip's lifetime. For years, it remained buried beneath layers of legal language, overshadowed by larger discussions surrounding titles, succession, and royal responsibilities. But once historians, advisors, and palace observers began revisiting the documents more closely, a startling possibility started to emerge. What if one carefully written provision had been designed not merely to distribute assets, but to protect an entire legacy from future interference? The rumors spread cautiously at first. Those familiar with royal affairs understood the sensitivities surrounding private estate matters. Yet the more details that surfaced, the more difficult it became to ignore the growing speculation. Reports suggested that the clause contained unusually strict protections concerning the future stewardship of assets connected to the Edinburgh legacy. Rather than allowing broad flexibility, it allegedly established clear boundaries regarding how certain responsibilities and benefits could be passed forward. If true, this was not simply routine estate planning. It represented something much more deliberate. What made the story even more compelling was the language reportedly contained within the provision itself. According to various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, the clause appeared designed to preserve the Edinburgh line in a very specific way. The emphasis was not on immediate convenience or personal preference. Instead, the focus seemed centered on continuity. The document allegedly reflected Prince Philip's long-standing belief that some traditions required protection from changing circumstances and shifting political realities. For supporters of this interpretation, the clause was not a restriction. It was a safeguard, a final effort by Philip to ensure that the legacy he spent decades building would remain intact long after he was gone. However, not everyone agreed on what the provision actually meant. Legal experts reportedly found themselves debating the wording and its potential implications. Some believed the clause simply reinforced existing expectations. Others argued that it carried far greater authority than previously understood. Every new interpretation seemed to raise additional questions rather than provide clear answers. And with each passing discussion, the sense of mystery only deepened. The more people examined the document, the more they realized that its true significance might extend far beyond what anyone originally assumed. At the center of those debates stood an increasingly uncomfortable question. Who exactly was intended to benefit from these protections? And perhaps more importantly, who was not? That question transformed the conversation entirely. What had begun as an academic examination of a state language slowly evolved into something much more personal. Suddenly, royal watchers were no longer discussing abstract legal principles. They were discussing individuals' influence and the future balance of power within the royal family itself. It was at this stage that Queen Camilla's name began appearing more frequently in private conversations and public speculation. No official claims were made, and much remained uncertain. Yet reports increasingly suggested that the practical effect of the clause could limit certain expectations regarding influence over aspects of the Edinburgh legacy. Whether those interpretations were correct remained the subject of intense debate. Nevertheless, the realization spread rapidly through royal circles. If the clause functioned as many believed, then its consequences reached far beyond paperwork and legal theory. What started as a forgotten passage buried deep within old estate documents was beginning to reshape conversations throughout the monarchy. Every new revelation seemed to raise the stakes. Every fresh interpretation created new tensions. And as more people grasped the potential impact of Philip's carefully crafted safeguard, curiosity gave way to controversy, drawing the entire royal household into a growing storm that was only beginning to gather strength. What began as a legal curiosity soon evolved into a palace controversy once the implications became impossible to ignore. For years, Queen Camilla had successfully navigated some of the most difficult transitions in modern royal history. But insiders now claimed she had encountered a barrier unlike any she had faced before, one created not by a living rival, but by Prince Philip himself. The growing controversy surrounding the alleged clause transformed the conversation inside royal circles. What had started as speculation about inheritance documents was now becoming something much larger, a debate about influence, authority, and the limits of power within one of the world's most famous families. For years, Camilla had demonstrated remarkable resilience. She endured public criticism, navigated complex family dynamics, and gradually secured her place at the heart of the monarchy. Many observers viewed that journey as one of the most significant royal transformations of modern times. Yet according to increasing reports, the discovery of Philip's carefully crafted provision threatened to create a challenge unlike anything she had previously encountered. At the center of the discussion was a simple but powerful question. What expectations existed regarding the future influence surrounding the Edinburgh legacy? No official answers emerged, but speculation intensified as more commentators examined the potential implications of the clause. Some believed that the changing structure of the monarchy naturally opened new opportunities for different royal figures to shape important family matters. Others argued that Prince Philip had anticipated such possibilities years earlier and had deliberately established safeguards to prevent certain forms of influence from extending beyond specific boundaries. This is where the alleged clause became so significant. Reports suggested that its language may have restricted particular avenues of control connected to the Edinburgh inheritance. If those interpretations proved accurate, the provision was not merely protecting assets, it was protecting intent. It was preserving a vision that Philip had spent decades developing. That distinction mattered enormously, because once a document shifts from managing property to defending purpose, its impact becomes far more profound. Inside royal circles, reactions reportedly varied. Some advisors viewed the provision as a masterstroke of long-term planning. Others privately questioned whether such restrictions were necessary. Yet, even among those who disagreed on the details, appeared to be growing recognition that Philip's foresight could not be dismissed lightly. The deeper they examined his decisions, the clearer it became that he may have considered scenarios far beyond his own lifetime. Every conversation seemed to return to the same conclusion. Prince Philip was not simply thinking about the present. He was thinking about generations yet to come. The controversy also revived a long-standing tension that has followed the monarchy throughout its modern history. How much should change be embraced, and how much tradition should be protected? Supporters of modernization often argue that institutions must evolve in order to survive. Defenders of tradition counter that certain foundations must remain untouched if the institution is to retain its identity. The alleged clause appeared to sit directly at the intersection of those competing philosophies. It became a symbol of a much larger struggle between adaptation and preservation. Meanwhile, public fascination continued to grow. The possibility that Prince Philip had quietly anticipated future conflicts captured the imagination of royal watchers across the world. Every new rumor fueled fresh debate. Every interpretation generated additional questions. People who had never paid attention to inheritance structures suddenly found themselves drawn into discussions about legacy, stewardship, and royal succession. The mystery had evolved beyond legal paperwork. It had become a story about one man's determination to shape the future long after his voice had fallen silent. As scrutiny intensified, attention increasingly shifted toward the future itself. The Edinburgh inheritance was no longer viewed solely as a historical legacy. It was becoming a test of whether Philip's wishes would continue to guide royal decisions in the years ahead. And as observers searched for the individual most closely connected to that vision, one name surfaced again and again, quietly but consistently, preparing the stage for the next chapter of this unfolding drama. As debate intensified, another royal quietly stepped into the spotlight. The one figure many believed Philip had prepared for this moment all along. Unlike many royal dramas, this chapter was not defined by confrontation. Instead, it centered on patience, loyalty, and decades of quiet service that suddenly carried enormous significance. As speculation surrounding Prince Philip's alleged clause continued to grow, attention gradually shifted away from controversy and toward a figure who had spent much of his royal life avoiding it altogether. While headlines often gravitated toward larger personalities and more dramatic disputes, Prince Edward had built his reputation in a very different way. His story was not one of sudden triumphs or public battles. It was a story of consistency, reliability, and an unwavering commitment to duty. And now, as questions mounted about Philip's final wishes, those qualities were becoming more important than ever. For decades, the relationship between Prince Philip and Prince Edward attracted relatively little public attention. Yet those who followed royal affairs closely often pointed to the unique understanding that existed between them. Edward was frequently described as the son who shared many of Philip's values, particularly his preference for substance over spectacle. While others occupied the center of public attention, Edward quietly carried out responsibilities with little expectation of praise. Over time, that approach appeared to earn something invaluable from his father: confidence. That trust would prove increasingly significant as discussions about the Edinburgh legacy intensified. Reports suggested that Edward had become deeply involved in efforts to understand and preserve the intentions behind Philip's estate arrangements. While much of the public conversation focused on speculation surrounding the clause itself, attention behind the scenes reportedly centered on stewardship. The question was no longer simply what the document said. The question was who could best ensure that its purpose was respected. According to various accounts, Edward worked closely with advisors reviewing the historical framework surrounding the Edinburgh inheritance. These discussions were not portrayed as dramatic power struggles. Instead, they reflected a careful effort to balance legal obligations with personal responsibility. Every detail appeared to carry weight. Every interpretation mattered. And with each new review, the impression strengthened that Philip may have anticipated Edward playing a crucial role in safeguarding the legacy he left behind. Many observers believe this trust was not granted casually. Throughout his life, Philip placed enormous value on responsibility and discretion. Sensitive matters required steady hands and calm judgment. Reports have long suggested that he viewed Edward as someone capable of handling those demands without seeking personal recognition. In a family often defined by public visibility, Edward's quiet approach may have become one of his greatest strengths. The qualities that once kept him away from headlines were now drawing him directly into one of the most discussed royal stories of recent years. Public perception began changing as well. For years, Edward was often viewed as a dependable but understated member of the royal family. Now, many people started seeing him through a different lens. The growing focus on Philip's legacy highlighted the importance of those who preserve institutions rather than simply represent them. Suddenly, Edward's decades of service seemed less like a background contribution and more like preparation for a responsibility that had been quietly waiting for him all along. As this realization spread, The Edinburgh estate itself took on even greater symbolic significance. It was no longer viewed merely as an inheritance matter or a legal debate. It became a living connection to Prince Philip's values, priorities, and vision for the future. Every discussion about the estate seemed to reinforce the same idea. Although Philip was gone, his influence remained remarkably present. Through carefully planned arrangements, trusted relationships, and enduring principles, he continued shaping decisions long after his passing. Yet, even as Edward's role strengthened, King Charles found himself caught between family loyalties and the weight of his father's final wishes. No one understood the competing pressures better than King Charles. As monarch, husband, and son, he stood at the intersection of every expectation, every tradition, and every unresolved family question. As Prince Edward's role in protecting the Edinburgh legacy became increasingly apparent, attention inevitably shifted toward the one individual whose position made every decision infinitely more complicated. King Charles was not simply observing the unfolding controversy from a distance. He was living at its very center. Every discussion surrounding Prince Philip's alleged clause carried personal consequences for him. Every interpretation of the document touched multiple parts of his life simultaneously. He was the king responsible for safeguarding the institution, the husband whose family relationships could be affected, and the son entrusted with honoring the wishes of a father whose influence still seemed to shape events from beyond the grave. That balancing act was never going to be easy. Throughout his life, Charles had often found himself navigating difficult intersections between duty and personal loyalty. Yet this situation carried a unique emotional weight. Reports suggested that conversations regarding the clause were not simply legal exercises. They were deeply connected to questions of trust, intention, and legacy. If Prince Philip had indeed established specific protections for the Edinburgh inheritance, then Charles faced an uncomfortable reality. Respecting those provisions might require difficult decisions, even when those decisions affected people closest to him. The challenge was compounded by the growing public fascination surrounding the story. What had once been confined to private discussions among royal advisors was now attracting widespread attention. Every new rumor generated fresh headlines. Every alleged detail prompted another wave of debate. People were no longer asking whether the clause existed. They were asking what it meant, who it protected, and how it might influence the future direction of the royal family. The pressure on Charles increased with every passing day. According to various reports, internal discussions became increasingly focused on understanding the true purpose behind the provision. Advisors were said to be examining not only the legal language itself, but also the broader context surrounding Philip's intentions. This distinction mattered enormously. A document can contain words, but understanding the purpose behind those words often proves far more complicated. What exactly had Philip hoped to achieve? Was he protecting an inheritance, preserving a tradition, or attempting to secure a vision for the future? The answers remained elusive, yet they carried tremendous significance. For Charles, those questions were impossible to separate from the legacy left by both of his parents. Prince Philip had spent decades emphasizing duty, discipline, and continuity. Queen Elizabeth had devoted her entire reign to preserving stability during times of extraordinary change. Together, they represented a generation defined by sacrifice and service. Their influence formed the foundation upon which Charles now ruled. As speculation intensified, many observers began viewing the controversy through a broader lens. This was no longer simply about one estate or one provision hidden within legal paperwork. It was about whether the values that shaped the previous generation would continue guiding the monarchy into the future. At the same time, the institution itself faced growing expectations. Modern monarchies survive through continuity. They depend upon the careful transfer of responsibilities, traditions, and principles across generations. Every major decision sends a message about what will be preserved and what may be allowed to change. The alleged clause became a symbol of that larger struggle. People saw in it a test of whether the monarchy would prioritize personal interests or remain committed to the long-term vision established by those who came before. As Charles confronted these competing pressures, the significance of the controversy continued expanding. The inheritance questions remained important, but they were no longer the central issue. Something much larger had emerged from beneath the surface. What began as a debate over documents was transforming into a fundamental examination of how royal traditions are protected, challenged, and ultimately preserved for future generations. But the deeper story was no longer about one estate. It had become a test of how the monarchy protects its most sacred traditions. By this stage, the argument had expanded beyond legal documents and inheritance structures. What was really being contested was something far more powerful: the meaning of royal legacy itself. What made the controversy surrounding Prince Philip's alleged clause so compelling was that it had gradually outgrown the narrow boundaries of law and inheritance. The public was no longer focused solely on who might control an estate or how a provision should be interpreted. Instead, a much larger question had emerged, one that touched the very heart of the monarchy. What does it truly mean to inherit a royal legacy? Is it something that can be owned, transferred, or controlled? Or is it something far deeper, something that must be protected and carried forward through service and sacrifice? This distinction became increasingly important as debate intensified. Ownership and stewardship may sound similar, but within royal tradition they represent two very different ideas. Ownership suggests possession. Stewardship suggests responsibility. One focuses on rights, the other focuses on duty. Throughout his life, Prince Philip appeared to embrace the second principle above all else. He rarely spoke about legacy in terms of personal benefit. Instead, his actions consistently reflected a belief that institutions survive only when individuals place responsibility ahead of themselves. That philosophy shaped his decades of service, and according to many observers, it may have shaped the clause now generating so much attention. The more people examined Philip's life, the more they saw evidence of that commitment. He spent decades supporting the monarchy through periods of enormous change. He adapted to evolving public expectations while remaining fiercely protective of the institution's foundations. At times, his role required sacrifice. At other times, it required patience. Yet through every challenge, he appeared guided by a consistent belief that duty must remain stronger than personal ambition. That belief now seemed woven into the very legacy he left behind. As public discussion continued, the controversy also reignited broader debates surrounding royal succession and tradition. Some argued that the monarchy must evolve continuously to remain relevant in a changing world. Others insisted that certain principles must remain protected if the institution is to retain its identity. The Edinburgh legacy suddenly became a symbol of that struggle. People who had never shown interest in estate documents found themselves debating the future direction of the royal family. The clause became more than a legal provision. It became a reflection of competing visions for what the monarchy should represent. Part of the reason the story resonated so deeply was the symbolic weight carried by the Edinburgh inheritance itself. For many royal supporters, it represented decades of service, loyalty, and continuity. It was linked not only to Prince Philip's personal journey but also to the values he spent a lifetime defending. Every discussion about the clause seemed to return to the same central idea. If Philip had indeed created protections around that legacy, then those protections were likely intended to preserve something far greater than property. This perspective explains why the controversy continued attracting attention long after the legal details became known. Supporters viewed the alleged clause as evidence of foresight. Critics questioned whether such safeguards were necessary. Yet regardless of where individuals stood, most agreed on one thing: the debate revealed an ongoing tension at the heart of modern monarchy. How does an ancient institution honor tradition while adapting to contemporary realities? How does it preserve continuity without resisting change entirely? Those questions had no easy answers. As the arguments slowly cooled and the speculation began to settle, the focus shifted once again. The estate mattered. The inheritance mattered. The legal interpretations mattered. But beneath all of those discussions lingered a more profound mystery. The deeper people looked into Prince Philip's decisions, the more they wondered whether the clause was merely a legal mechanism or part of a larger message he intended future generations to understand. And as the dust slowly settled, one final question remained: what message had Prince Philip intended to leave behind? Years after his passing, Prince Philip's influence appeared stronger than ever. Not through speeches or ceremonies, but through a carefully constructed safeguard that continued shaping royal decisions from beyond the grave. As the controversy surrounding the alleged clause finally approached its conclusion, a remarkable realization began to emerge. The story had never truly been about legal language, inheritance structures, or competing interpretations. Those elements may have sparked the debate, but they were only part of a much larger picture. At its core, this was a story about Prince Philip himself. It was about the values he championed, the responsibilities he embraced, and the vision for the monarchy that guided him throughout his life. For decades, Philip stood as one of the monarchy's strongest defenders. Through periods of uncertainty, public scrutiny, and enormous social change, he remained committed to the idea that royal service demanded sacrifice. He understood that institutions survive only when individuals place something larger than themselves first. That belief shaped countless decisions throughout his life, and according to many interpretations, it may have shaped the clause that continued generating discussion years after his passing. If the provision existed as described, then it represented more than a legal safeguard. It represented a final expression of the principles that defined him. The Edinburgh legacy became the clearest symbol of that philosophy. What began as a title eventually evolved into something much more meaningful. It reflected decades of commitment, countless responsibilities, and a lifetime devoted to preserving continuity. The estate, the inheritance, and the surrounding traditions became intertwined with Philip's understanding of duty itself. That is why the alleged clause resonated so strongly with royal supporters. They did not see it merely as a restriction. They saw it as a declaration that some responsibilities must be protected, even when circumstances change. At the center of that responsibility stood Prince Edward. Throughout the unfolding debate, his role continued to grow in significance. Not because he sought attention, but because he embodied many of the qualities that Philip valued most: patience, loyalty, consistency. The qualities that often go unnoticed during moments of celebrations become indispensable during periods of uncertainty. As discussions surrounding the Edinburgh legacy continued, Edward increasingly appeared as the steward entrusted with carrying forward a vision carefully developed over generations. The responsibility was not glamorous, but it was enormously important. King Charles also faced his own defining moment. As both monarch and son, he found himself balancing personal relationships with institutional obligations. The challenge was never simple. Yet, as events unfolded, many observers came to believe that Charles understood something fundamental about his father's intentions. Preserving continuity does not mean resisting all change. It means ensuring that change never erases the values that make the institution worth preserving. In accepting that reality, Charles demonstrated the same commitment to duty that had guided both Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth throughout their lives. Even Queen Camilla's place within the story evolved over time. Early speculation focused heavily on whether the alleged provision affected expectations surrounding influence and inheritance. Yet, as the larger meaning of the controversy became clearer, attention gradually shifted away from individual personalities and toward the institution itself. The monarchy has always existed through adaptation, compromise, and continuity. Every generation faces new challenges. Every generation inherits responsibilities shaped by those who came before. Camilla, like every member of the royal family, became part of that ongoing evolution. In the final analysis, the enduring fascination surrounding the clause reveals something profound about the House of Windsor. People were drawn to the story not because of legal complexities, but because it touched on universal questions about legacy, loyalty, and responsibility. Long after titles change hands and headlines fade away, those questions remain. In the end, the clause was never simply about blocking someone from an estate. It was about preserving a legacy Prince Philip spent a lifetime building, a final reminder that within the House of Windsor, duty has always been intended to outlast every individual who serves it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.